Indian Bolivia has a very ancient history with the coca leaf, which was grown traditionally in the tropical yungas, it was called, ravines. There are these, it's like the montaña in Peru, but they're ravines that were actually very close to La Paz. And the use of coca then, as well as now, was very well integrated throughout Bolivian society, including during the 1940s by the Bolivian economic elites, who were the ones who actually grew coca in these, they dominated the coca plantations of the Yungas region, and they had for the 2 centuries or more. Unlike Peru, in Bolivia, Peru had never been industrialized. That is, it had never been processed into cocaine. There are some interesting reasons, I think, for that. And it had never been really transformed into an overseas or modern medical commodity. It wasn't exported from Bolivia. There was a lot of coca use within Bolivian society, but it was not the same as the Peruvian commodity coca and cocaine. By 1952, however, you begin to see cocaine germinated by outsiders, by displaced Peruvians, who I mentioned to you before, by these Chilean clans along the coast, by Cuban mafiosos, and by Jewish or German refugees in the country. The revolution opened the lid for cocaine in a way, as Bolivia suffered an intense decade of disorganized authority. Some of you may know this or not, but for example, the Bolivian army disintegrated during the 1950s in its entirety. There was a great deal of economic stress. There were peasant uprisings, and the land reform actually dismantled the coca plantations of the Yungas, and many peasants streamed down into the lower Amazonian regions and began cultivating crops like coca there in the lowlands of Bolivia. So soon, very early in the 1950s, you begin to see in La Paz and in Cochabamba dozens of small labs that pop up and down, and by the late 1950s, the rise of a Bolivian national entrepreneurial class involved with cocaine. Now, the most interesting and amazing of the figures in this group in the 1950s was the notorious, they always, in all the U.S. reports, the police reports, they always refer to her as the clever international trafficker Blanca Ibanez de Sanchez, who's also here in your photo. Blanca was not caught until 1965, despite generating this very vibrant set of international cocaine trails from Bolivia to Havana. She spent a lot of time in Cuba developing this, Panama, Argentina, and had her own network on the streets of New York and later in Miami. Blanca, you can probably guess, was not her real name. It's like a trade name, you know, Blanca, you know, white stuff. Cocaine, from the very beginning, and actually going back to the period when it was a legal commodity, very quickly had almost exactly the same, how should we say, nicknames as it does today. You know, it was referred to as snow, sometimes as Merc in Latin America. Blanca also sometimes was known as Delicia, so you could get some idea of the type of trade that she was involved in. And incidentally, there were a lot of women who were involved in the early drug trades. You just don't find her, you find a lot of women who set up trading businesses. There was a kind of a career path. They would become mules. They tended to be kind of upper class Latin American women who were being used as mules because it was unthinkable at that time that, you know, customs officials would actually search a respectable white woman from Latin America. But Blanca went on to make her own career and became the boss, really, of most of the Bolivian cocaine industry during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Bolivia also saw a number of dramatic political drug scandals which tainted the revolutionary politicos, like the key leftist union leader and politician Juan Nachin in 1961. Most of these scandals were connected in one way or another to this revolutionary police chief, the actual head of the revolutionary police in Bolivia, whose name was Luis Garay, who happened to be, it's a long and complex and colorful story, he happened to actually be a Chilean. And he was closely related to this Wasaf Harb drug trafficking group on the coast of Chile. As in Cuba, these 1961 scandals, and it was a big scandal in the whole, there was this huge congressional trial that was held of drug traffickers in Bolivia in 1961, turned out to be a turning point in Bolivian cocaine. The United States, applying intense pressure on Bolivia, finally got Bolivia to adopt anti-drug laws. There had actually been no anti-drug laws on the books in Bolivia up to this time, and to begin a kind of anti-Coca crusade in the country. You know, in a country that really had nothing per se against Coca, and still has nothing per se against Coca today. The main effect of this campaign in the early 60s, however, was exactly the opposite. It was to displace illicit cocaine from these upland towns to very inaccessible coca frontiers across the lowland Amazon in Santa Cruz, that's close to the Brazilian border. The Chapare was connected to Cochabamba, but was is today still the tropical lowland Amazonian region of the province of Cochabamba. And in the process, what was happening here in the early 1960s was that coca and cocaine were gaining a novel social force. They were mobilizing a new group in the history of cocaine, and that was the peasants, illicit coca peasants, thousands of peasants who were tied now in the 1960s to hundreds of new narcos selling to Cubans and Chileans and moving cocaine en masse out of Bolivia. So by 1964, Bolivia enters what I think of as an unstoppable phase in cocaine's growth. And you see this in the Interpol, was already involved in the anti-cocaine trafficking. They began to send agents down to the Bolivian lowlands, and they reported on hundreds, really, of arrests and raids each year of these coca peasants in low-level dark sewer in the Bolivian lowlands. But by 1964, it was becoming unstoppable, and in the process, it was also this rise of illicit cocaine was also stimulating a parallel development way back in Peru. The price was going up of coca paste way back in Peru, in this area, the Huallaga Valley region. So the two of these areas by the mid-1960s and late 1960s were becoming kind of hotbeds of illicit cocaine.